They never wanted you to know this. Deep inside the sands of Egypt lies a secret story that was buried, rewritten, and nearly erased from history. A king who was not a man, a pharaoh who wasn't supposed to exist, a daughter who dared to steal Egypt's throne and wear the crown of a god. Her name was Hatshepsut, but the scribes who followed tried to chisel her face from the temples, scratch out her name from the stones, and burn her memory from the scrolls. Why? Because what she did was forbidden, unimaginable. She became Pharaoh in a world where only men could rule. And the shocking part, she didn't just rule, she built one of the greatest golden ages Egypt had ever seen. But here's the secret no one tells you. Hatshepsut's story isn't only about power, it's about betrayal. Divine lies, stolen identities, and a throne drenched in whispers of blood and vengeance. Once you hear it, you'll never look at the pyramids and temples the same way again, because behind their perfect stone faces, they're still hiding the story of Egypt's first great queen who was erased. The Nile moved like a ribbon of living gold beneath the pale dawn sky. Mist clung to its banks, curling around the reeds where herons stood frozen, waiting for their first strike. Egypt was waking, its farmers shouldering baskets of grain, its fishermen drawing in the night's catch, and its priests already chanting hymns to Ra, the sun god, as the first rays bled across the horizon. In the heart of Thebes, within the palatial walls that rose like cliffs of carved sandstone, a child stirred in her bed. Her name was Hatshepsut, daughter of a king, born not into obscurity, but into the very furnace where dynasties were forged and thrones were contested like prey among lions. From the very beginning, whispers surrounded her. She was not a fragile princess to be pampered in jeweled halls. No, she was the blood of Pharaoh Thutmose I, a warrior king who had carried Egypt's banners far beyond its southern borders. In the royal nursery, Hatshepsut grew up not with dolls or idle diversions, but with the sight of soldiers polishing their bronze, of scribes bending over papyrus scrolls filled with accounts of conquest, of architects unrolling plans for temples that would scrape the sky. She was a child of thunder, born into a house where ambition burned hotter than the desert sun. But here lies the twist the world never expected. From the moment she opened her eyes, Hatshepsut lived in a cage, disguised as a palace. She was royal, yes, but she was a girl. In Egypt, the throne was the domain of men, passed like a sacred flame from father to son, or at worst from brother to brother. A woman could be consort, regent, priestess, never pharaoh. That word was reserved for those who carried the divine embodiment of Horus on earth. And Horus, the falcon god, was always male. The rules were carved in stone. But Hatshepsut, even as a child, seemed to look at those stones and see cracks. She was different from her siblings. She had eyes that lingered too long on the ceremonies of power, ears that absorbed the secret conversations in the throne room. When priests recited lineage and bloodlines, she asked questions that made even hardened courtiers glance nervously at one another. How fragile was legitimacy? What happened if the rightful heir was too young, too weak, or too far from Thebes? What if the gods spoke not through tradition, but through strength of will? These were dangerous questions, and yet they sprouted in her mind like reeds after the flood. As she grew, so too did the drama of succession. Pharaoh Thutmose, I had sons. Yes, But not all survived the ruthless lottery of childhood. Disease, accidents, rivalries, they chipped away at the royal nursery until the line of inheritance became perilously thin. When her half-brother, Thutmose II, was declared heir, the court exhaled in relief. Order was preserved. But Hatshepsut knew something the others did not. She knew that Thutmose II was frail, coughing blood into silken cloths, unable to lead men into battle or inspire the masses with thunderous decrees. His reign, when it came, would be one of shadows. And shadows are dangerous places for those who wish to survive. She played her part at first, the dutiful sister, the royal bride. Yes, in keeping with Egyptian custom, Hatshepsut was married to Thutmose II, her half-brother, to preserve the purity of the bloodline. But behind the veils of ceremony, she was already studying the machinery of power. She watched the viziers weigh every decision, the generals vie for influence, the priests spin divine narratives to sanctify political moves. She memorized every lever and pulley of the great machine of state until she could have run it herself blindfolded. And in time she did. Because Thutmose II was weak, the true weight of governance often fell into Hatshepsut's hands. Courtiers noticed, priests noticed, and Hatshepsut noticed them noticing. She gave orders not as suggestions from a queen consort, but as if she were already Pharaoh. And strangely enough, people obeyed. Perhaps they obeyed because it was easier. Perhaps because the state needed strength. Or perhaps because even in the corridors of power, men are drawn not only to tradition but to charisma. And Hatshepsut's charisma was like a flame in the desert night. But the story darkens. For if her husband was weak, he was not immortal. Thutmose II's reign ended abruptly, consumed by sickness that neither physicians nor prayers could cure. Egypt mourned, but beneath the wails of the priests and the solemn processions, fear gripped the court. The heir was a child, Thutmose III, the son of a concubine, too young to reign, too vulnerable to protect the throne. Egypt stood at the edge of chaos, and chaos is where dynasties die. It was here, at this fragile moment, that Hatshepsut made her move. She declared herself regent, caretaker of the throne, until the boy was old enough to rule. No one could argue. It was tradition. Widowed queens had often served as regents before. But Hatshepsut was no ordinary regent. She did not simply guard the throne. She began to sit upon it, at first cautiously, cloaking her decrees in the name of Thutmose III. But over time, the language changed. She stopped speaking as a caretaker and began to speak. She commissioned monuments, ordered expeditions, spoke in inscriptions as if the divine Ka of Horus flowed through her veins. And then came the audacious leap. She took the titles of Pharaoh for herself, not regent, not Queen Pharaoh. She wore the Nena's headdress, the false beard, the kilt of kings. She appeared in temples carved, not as a woman, but as a man. The world reeled. The court was stunned. Never before had a woman so openly, so brazenly claimed what was forbidden. It was a theft in plain sight, but it was also something more. It was genius. Because Hatshepsut understood the truth. Power is not seized in a moment. It is built brick by brick, until people no longer remember when the old order ended and the new one began. This was her gamble. She would rewrite the narrative. She would convince Egypt that she was not a usurper, but destiny incarnate. She wove stories of divine birth, claiming that Amen himself had descended to her mother's chambers and fathered her. She filled temples with imagery of her legitimacy, surrounded herself with loyal priests who declared her rule ordained by the gods, and slowly, astonishingly, the resistance began to crumble. Egypt, desperate for stability, accepted her, not fully, not without whispers, but enough to allow her to reign. Yet beneath the triumph, shadows lurked. For every courtier who bent the knee, another ground his teeth in silence. For every priest who hailed her as Pharaoh, another muttered that she was a blasphemy in human form. And watching, always watching, was the child Thutmose III, growing older, growing stronger, growing more dangerous. Hatshepsut had stolen the throne. But the true story, the betrayals, the rivalries, the blood that would stain the Nile, was only beginning. The temple drums echoed through Thebes like the heartbeat of the gods. Their hollow rhythm carried over the courtyards, across the rows of sandstone pillars, through the sacred precincts heavy with incense. Egypt had a new pharaoh, or at least that was what the inscriptions now proclaimed. But the Egypt that awoke to her rule was not a silent servant, bowing its head in blind obedience. It was a restless giant, muttering beneath its breath, testing her resolve. Hatshepsut's coronation was no ordinary ceremony. Every coronation was meant to transform a mortal into a living god, to cloak the chosen ruler in the eternal aura of Horus and Ra. But this time, the ritual carried a tension that crackled like a storm trapped inside the temple walls. The priests of Amen draped her in the royal regalia, the blue caprish crown, the crook and flail, the false beard that had adorned the chins of her ancestors. Yet the whispers surged like a swarm of insects. A woman, wearing the beard of kings, a daughter of Egypt, pretending to be its son. Hatshepsut stood unflinching. If they saw a charade, she would force them to see destiny. Her voice carried through the halls with the weight of command. She recited the ancient hymns, not as a queen supplicating for divine favor, but as Pharaoh himself, declaring unity with the gods. "It is Amun who has chosen me," she proclaimed. "Amun who fashioned me in the womb of my mother. Amun who placed me upon this throne. To reject me is to reject the will of the God of gods." The words were blasphemous to some, thrilling to others. And most importantly, they were effective. The priests of Ammon, always pragmatic, saw opportunity. A pharaoh who owed her throne to their blessings was a pharaoh who would reward them richly. And Hatshepsut did not disappoint. She poured wealth into their temples, ordered colossal obelisks to rise like stone flames in honor of Amun, and bound her legitimacy to theirs so tightly that even dissenters hesitated to separate the two. Still, coronation was only theater. Real power lay in the granaries, the army camps, the trade routes stretching into lands where Egypt's name was both revered and feared. Here was Hatshepsut's challenge. She had to prove not just that she could wear the crown, but that she could wield it. Egypt had enemies beyond its borders, restless Nubians in the south, ambitious powers in the Levant. Its wealth depended on delicate balances, ships braving the Red Sea to fetch exotic goods, caravans threading the deserts with ivory, incense, and gold. To falter even slightly was to invite rivals to strike. So Hatshepsut set about constructing not only monuments but narratives. She understood what few rulers before her had. History was not merely recorded, it was engineered. Every inscription, every statue, every temple relief became a weapon in her arsenal. She ordered scenes carved, where she appeared not as a woman but as Pharaoh, broad-shouldered, bearded, the embodiment of kingship itself. In some, she was depicted as both male and female, merging the two in a divine paradox that left onlookers unsure whether they were witnessing blasphemy or revelation. The ambiguity was intentional. If the people could not reconcile the contradiction, they would be forced to accept it as divine mystery. Meanwhile, she began a campaign of alliances. The generals, wary of her untested leadership, found themselves rewarded with promotions, new estates, and honors that secured their loyalty. The bureaucrats were lavished with gifts, their families granted positions in the ever-expanding machinery of the state. Egypt, under Hatshepsut's hand, became a stage where every player had a role, and every role was written by her. Yet the greatest stroke of genius came not from war, but from peace. Hatshepsut looked beyond Egypt's borders, to the fabled land of Punta Place, half legendary, whispered of in marketplaces as a paradise of wealth. Ivory, ebony, myrrh, gold, and exotic animals were said to pour from Punt's shores, but no pharaoh in living memory had dared such an expedition. The seas were treacherous, the deserts brutal. To attempt it was madness. To succeed was immortality, and so she gambled. She commissioned a fleet of massive ships, each hewn from cedar and lashed with ropes thick as a man's arm. She gathered crews of sailors, navigators, interpreters, and soldiers, binding them under oaths that their journey was divinely sanctioned. When the ships finally slipped from the docks of the Red Sea, prayers rising with the gulls overhead, Egypt held its breath. Months passed with no word. Some whispered the expedition had perished, claimed that the gods themselves had punished Hatshepsut's audacity. But then, one dawn, the horizon bloomed with sails. The fleet had returned, their decks groaning with treasure. Myrrh trees, still rooted in their soil, were carried back to Egypt, to be planted in the sacred courtyards of Thebes, as if a piece of Punt's paradise itself had been stolen and transplanted onto Egyptian soil. The spectacle was beyond imagination. Markets overflowed with goods never before seen, temples perfumed with incense from distant lands, nobles parading exotic animals like trophies of a new golden age. And at the center of it all was Hatshepsut, the pharaoh who had defied the gods' order, now standing as their chosen vessel. Her propaganda machine carved the story into stone. Hatshepsut, daughter of Amen, blessed by the heavens, bringer of prosperity. In the minds of her subjects, she was no longer a usurper. She was a miracle, but miracles come at a cost. For every obelisk that rose, for every temple wall that proclaimed her divinity, there was someone watching, waiting, seething. The boy king Thutmose III, growing into manhood under her shadow, nursed his resentment like a hidden flame. To the world, he was Keruler, his name paired with hers in ceremonial inscriptions. In truth, he was sidelined, his authority a hollow shell. Every victory she claimed was another reminder that the throne he had been born to inherit had been stolen by the woman meant only to guard it. Court whispers grew sharper. Some said she poisoned rivals, others that she bribed the gods themselves. Few dared speak openly, but dissent was a river underground. carving unseen channels that one day could burst to the surface. Even as Hatshepsut's reign glittered with prosperity, danger simmered beneath it, waiting for the moment when glory would turn to blood. For now, however, Egypt basked in the brilliance of its female pharaoh. The Nile's floods were generous, the granaries full, the temples magnificent. Travelers from distant kingdoms carried tales of her grandeur. Merchants spoke her name with awe, and commoners whispered prayers in her honor. She had defied the impossible and bent the world to her will. But every golden age casts long shadows, and in those shadows destiny was stirring. The sun beat down upon the Valley of the Kings, its light scattering across cliffs that rose like the petrified waves of an ancient sea. Here, among the bones of pharaohs long past, a new story was being etched, not in stone coffins or burial chambers, but in the living architecture of empire. Hatshepsut's reign had blossomed into something few dared imagine: stability, prosperity, glory. And yet, as every ruler learns, the higher the climb, the thinner the air. What rises in splendor must someday tremble on the edge of collapse. By the time her ships had returned from Punt and her obelisks towered above Karnak, Hatshepsut was not merely pharaoh in name. She was pharaoh in every heartbeat of Egypt. Her image stared down from colossal statues, her likeness chiseled into temple walls. She appeared both male and female, a paradox that confounded enemies and reassured allies. Her propaganda machine had done its work well. Egypt now breathed her name as naturally as it did the Nile's floods. But the court was a serpent's nest, and in the shadows venom gathered. Thutmose III, once a fragile boy, was now entering the storm of manhood. Tall, strong, with the warrior's instinct of his grandfather, Thutmose I. He had begun to see himself not as a sidelined child, but as the rightful ruler. Day by day, his resentment deepened, gnawing like a rat at the edges of his soul. The priests, the generals, the scribes, many of them, swore loyalty to Hatshepsut. But in whispered chambers, some turned their eyes toward the young man destined by blood to wear the crown. Hatshepsut knew this. She was too shrewd, too experienced, to underestimate the danger. And so she played her greatest game of balance. She continued to rule as pharaoh, issuing decrees, leading grand projects, launching expeditions. But she never erased Thutmose III completely. His name appeared alongside hers in official inscriptions. Coins bore their dual authority. At ceremonies, he stood just a step behind her throne, like a shadow tethered to her light. It was a performance as delicate as it was dangerous. To deny him entirely would spark revolt, but to grant him real power would threaten her own. In the meantime, she turned Egypt itself into her fortress. The temple of dear el-Bahari rose from the cliffs, like a vision from the Gaza, terraced masterpiece of colonnades, ramps, and sanctuaries, each level climbing higher as though reaching toward the heavens. Here, carved reliefs told the story of her divine birth, her coronation, her triumphs. To the casual eye, it was art. To the discerning, it was strategy. Every wall was propaganda, every carving a blade in her arsenal. For in Egypt, stone endured when flesh failed. And Hatshepsut was determined that her stone would speak louder than any enemy's whispers. But stone cannot silence blood. Thutmose III began to gather quiet followers. The military, restless from years of peace, looked to him as a leader who might once more carry Egypt's banners into battle. Young nobles, chafing under the authority of a woman they had grown up mocking in secret, whispered that his time was coming. Even within the temples, cracks appeared. Not all priests were loyal to the Pharaoh, who bent gender and tradition until they cracked. Some muttered that the gods themselves must be offended, that Egypt's prosperity was a fragile illusion destined to shatter. And yet Hatshepsut endured. She was not merely cunning, she was beloved. The common people, the farmers who relied on the Nile, the merchants who thrived in bustling markets overflowing with goods, the builders whose hands shaped temples and tombs, they adored her. For what was a pharaoh, if not the bringer of stability? They did not care if she was man or woman. They cared only that the floods came, the fields prospered, the gods appeared satisfied, and Egypt thrived. And under Hatshepsut, all of this was true. Still, the tension coiled tighter. In her private chambers, perhaps she wondered how long the balance could last. Did she see the steel in Thutmose III's eyes as he stood beside her? Did she sense the growing hunger of a boy becoming a man who would one day test the strength of her grip? She must have, and yet she did not relent. She doubled down, commissioning even greater monuments, sending fresh expeditions to foreign lands, wrapping herself in the aura of divinity, until to challenge her was to challenge the gods themselves. But destiny has its own rhythms, and the Nile cannot flood forever. One day, inevitably, the current changes, and in the heart of Thebes, beneath the rising walls of dear el-Bahari, whispers began to spread. They spoke of betrayal. They spoke of secrets kept too long. They spoke of a storm gathering on the horizon, one that even the most magnificent queen could not escape. The torches flickered in the halls of Karnak, as if they too sensed the unease that now gripped Egypt. Hatshepsut's reign, once a blaze of triumph, had begun to dim at its edges. Prosperity still flowed through the Nile. Temples still rose in her honor. Markets still thrummed with wealth from Punt and beyond. But in the palace, where whispers cut deeper than blades, a storm was gathering. And at the center of that storm stood Thutmose III, no longer a boy, no longer patient, no longer willing to be the shadow of another's glory. He had grown into a warrior, trained in the arts of battle that Hatshepsut had largely neglected in her reign of trade and architecture. His arms bore the strength of the drill yard, his eyes the sharpness of a hawk circling its prey. Soldiers, weary of peace, looked to him with the longing of men denied their purpose. They wanted campaigns, they wanted spoils, they wanted songs sung of victories that reached beyond Egypt's borders. And Thutmose, hungry for power, gave them promises. Quietly, he began to weave his own web of loyalty, one thread at a time. Hatshepsut knew. How could she not? She was Pharaoh, mistress of spies, reader of silences. She saw the way men bowed to Thutmose, a heartbeat longer than to her. She saw the way the scribes' hands trembled when they wrote both their names side by side, as if uncertain which would survive the parchment of history. But she had built her throne on audacity, and audacity was not so easily surrendered. If Thutmose was gathering soldiers, she would gather gods. If he sought loyalty through fear, she would tighten her grip through legacy. Dear el-Bahari became her obsession. The temple rose higher, more magnificent, its terraces sweeping like a stairway to heaven itself. Every wall, every column, every relief was a declaration carved in defiance of time. I was Pharaoh. I was chosen. I was divine. She ordered her own story, inscribed in ways no other ruler had dared, her birth proclaimed as the will of Amen, her reign sanctified by divine decree. To erase her would be to erase the God's own hand. But gods are silent when mortals clash, and the clash was drawing near. For Thutmose had grown tired of waiting. Though publicly bound to her corrigency in the barracks and in the training fields, he was already Pharaoh in the eyes of the soldiers. He rode with them, drilled with them, spoke to them not as a distant monarch but as a commander in their midst. Their cheers were not the hollow cries of ceremony. They were the battle-hungry roars of men who would follow him into fire. The tension seeped through the air like smoke. In councils, Hatshepsut still sat in the throne of gold. Her voice calm, her decrees iron, but across the chamber, Thutmose's presence was a weight. His silence louder than words, his gaze promising storms to come. Did they speak to one another in private? Did she try to temper his rage, to bind him with maternal affection or political cunning? Or did they sit in the same palace, like two predators, sharing a cage, waiting for the other to move first? Outside, Egypt carried on, oblivious to the knife edge upon which its rulers balanced. Farmers planted their crops, merchants traded their wares, priests sang their hymns. Yet, even the common folk could sense its something in the air, a vibration beneath the everyday rhythm of life. Perhaps they saw it in the tightened jaw of a tax collector, in the restless eyes of a soldier on leave, in the hurried whispers of temple attendants. Egypt was not blind. Egypt was holding its breath. Then came the signs that even stone could not hide. Inscriptions began to shift. Reliefs once showing Hatshepsut alone began to bear subtle alterations. Cracks where chisels had worked in secret. Faces recut to resemble Thutmose. Her name, once eternal in carved hieroglyphs, showed faint scars where it had been scratched, replaced, or left suspiciously unfinished. The erasure had begun, not full, not yet, but enough to hint at what was coming. Still, Hatshepsut endured. She appeared in public with the regalia of Pharaoh, her false beard gleaming in the sunlight, her poise unbroken. She presided over rituals with all the majesty of divine authority, as though the gods themselves stood at her side. Perhaps she believed she could outlast the boy she had once sheltered, that her monuments would bind Egypt tighter than his swords ever could. Perhaps she thought she could weave eternity out of stone faster than he could muster it from blood. But history is merciless. At some point, no scribe dared record exactly when Hatshepsut vanished. Some say she died peacefully, her body entombed with honors befitting a pharaoh. Others whispered darker tales, that she was poisoned, that her life was cut short by those who had waited too long in silence. Whatever the truth, Thutmose III emerged from her shadow like a hawk released from its tether, and his vengeance was not quiet. One by one, Hatshepsut's images were attacked, her statues defaced, her name gouged out from temple walls, her memory hunted as though she had never existed. The boy who had stood behind her throne now stood upon it, and his first decree was to erase her from history. But the irony was cruel, 'cause the more he tried to destroy her, the more indelible her ghost became. The scars on the walls, the broken statues, the missing names, they all whispered of a presence too powerful to erase. Egypt had entered a new chapter, but the shadow of its first great queen lingered still, her silence louder than the roar of her successors' armies. The desert wind swept across the ruins of Thebes, whistling through the colonnades like a lament for the forgotten. By now, the name of Hatshepsut was a ghost, scraped from temple walls, chiseled from monuments, hammered from the stone that once proclaimed her divinity. To walk through Egypt in the years after her disappearance was to walk through a silence deliberately carved by her enemies. And yet, the silence spoke louder than words. Thutmose III ruled now. The warrior Pharaoh the soldiers had longed for, the boy who had waited in shadows, now bathed in the sun of conquest. His reign was a storm of campaigns, his armies marching into Canaan, Syria, and Nubia. Egypt's borders stretched farther than they ever had before, its coffers brimming with tribute from defeated kings. The people called him the Napoleon of Egypt, though that name would not be spoken for millennia. His victories were carved into stone, his glory sung in temples. But behind every triumph, behind every hymn, the shadow of Hatshepsut lingered. Why? Because to erase her, Thutmose had to remember her. Every chisel stroke that removed her face, every blow that shattered her statue, every careful erasure of her name was an admission. She had ruled, she had mattered, she had stolen something no man could reclaim. In trying to obliterate her, he preserved her ghost in absence. The walls became scars, and scars are stories the body refuses to forget. Historians would one day puzzle over her fate. Did she die of illness, carried gently into the afterlife with proper rites? Did Thutmose order her death in secret, poisoning her, silencing her before she could rally support? Did she sense it coming, looking from her palace windows at the cliffs of el-Bahari, knowing her magnificent temple might one day stand as her only voice? The truth is lost, swallowed by the sand. But the fact that questions remain is proof enough that she succeeded in her ultimate gamble. She could not be erased completely. Even in ruin, her presence was undeniable. At el-Bahari, her temple stood like a staircase to eternity, its reliefs faint, but still whispering of a woman who claimed divinity. In the villages along the Nile, stories survived in half-remembered fragments of a queen who wore the beard of kings, who sent ships across the sea, who defied the order of gods and men alike. Memory is stubborn. It clings like dust to the sandals of time, refusing to be swept away. And what of? For all his conquests, for all his glory, his legacy is bound to hers like two sides of a broken coin. Without her, he might never have been so determined to prove his strength. Without her, his erasures would have no meaning. Together, they form a paradox. The woman who ruled as Pharaoh and the man who tried to deny it. Both kings, both remembered, both haunted by each other across the centuries. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: Hatshepsut's story survived not because she ruled, but because she was forbidden to. Had she been another man in the endless line of pharaohs, her name might have blended into the chorus of kings. Instead, she broke the pattern. She defied the stone-carved rules. She forced Egyptian history to confront a truth it could not accept, that power is not bound by gender, that destiny does not bow to tradition. that even the greatest monuments of men can be stolen by the will of a woman thousands of years later. Archaeologists would brush sand from her temple walls, would puzzle over defaced statues, would piece together fragments of her story. They would whisper her name again, a name that had once been forbidden, once struck out by and in that whisper, Hatshepsut would rise again, victorious over time itself. For what is history, if not the voices of the silenced finally being heard? So, the next time you gaze upon the ruins of Egypt, the towering obelisks, the carved reliefs, the silent statues with their faces scraped away, remember the secret they tried to hide. Remember the king's daughter who stole Egypt's throne, who wore the beard of pharaohs, who built a golden age out of defiance. Her enemies tried to bury her in silence, but silence, too, tells a story, and Hatshepsut's story refuses to die.